All right, my name's Marcella, and I'm a partner biologist with NRCS, so I work with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies and NRCS. And my topic today is on backyard conservation, and so I chose to focus on birds and pollinators because those are two of the easier groups to create backyard habitat for. Most of the work I would typically do is on rangelands. So this is kind of a newer topic for me, but it's also something I'm interested in personally, so it was fun for me to pull this together. So thanks for having me here, and I hope you guys all get a chance to learn something. I did kind of create this presentation in a way that is visible on slides, but then I also have some handouts there. So if you want to take some home, it's set up to be relatively easy for that. So thanks. All right, so I went through this. All right, so I wanted to, for the purpose of this talk, I wanted to talk a little bit about planting natives for a few reasons. So a lot of people are deterred from planting natives because they're relatively difficult to find, and they can often be a little bit more expensive than horticultural varieties when you're trying to build your garden. But there are a few good reasons to use them. The first one is that they don't typically require as many inputs, whether that's fertilizers or pesticides. And for some people, that's a really important factor. For most people, I would say the water use is a really big factor. So native plants have been adapted to this climate in this area for a long time. And so they tend to handle drought stress a little bit better than most of the horticultural plants. And so that's a really great reason to plant them if you're looking for long-term, low maintenance, and typically better survival, especially on drought years. And then the two last reasons are most of the things I'll talk about today. One of them is cover for wildlife, so that includes cover for pollinators and cover for birds. And we'll talk a little bit about both of those. And then also food for wildlife, which is probably the bulk of my presentation is all about that. So for the first section, I wanted to talk briefly about pollinators. So I thought these were some kind of cool photos of how important native plants are for native pollinators. All three of these, it's somewhat difficult to see because they're very well camouflaged. So this is the moth there, and a moth there, and then this one has an arrow, but there's a moth there. So all of these native insects require these specific plants to be able to hide. And so having native plants in the garden is really helpful to attract a wide variety of insects. So greater diversity often yields a pretty good abundance of insects, which is important for a few reasons. So the first is just, in general, pollinators are declining across the globe. So these statistics in the upper right are particularly about bees, but the same trends occur across pollinators from different guilds, whether that's ants or beetles or moths. But in general, pollinators are either stable, declining. There are a few species that are increasing, but this has major impacts for food production for humans, as well as our native rangelands and how well those plants get pollinated. And part of that is because pollinators tend to be pretty specialized in how they pollinate each individual species of plant. And so having a great diversity of plants requires having a great diversity of insects to be able to pollinate them. So it's a little bit small, but the two ways that we can affect pollinator declines as backyard gardeners are listed here. So lack of flowers and poor nutrition for pollinators. And then here, including environmental pesticides, which are two of the 6 main reasons that bees in particular are declining. And so some people might also see this and think like, why does this matter anyways? And part of it is having that capability to produce food for people, but then also pollinators are a great source of food for birds. And since a lot of people like backyard birds, that's a great reason to have both a high abundance and high diversity of insects. So I thought these were some pretty mind-boggling facts, but worldwide birds eat 400 to 500 million metric tons of insects annually, which I honestly can't even comprehend what that looks like. But so we need a lot of insects for that. And 96% of terrestrial bird species will feed their young insects as they're rearing their broods. So again, it's really important to have a great diversity of insects. Having a wider variety provides kind of different peaks in insect populations that can be matched to different birds when they're raising their young. So having great diversity is important. And then that last fact about moth and butterfly caterpillars, again, just kind of touches on the fact that most of these species really require very particular plants to be able to survive and do well. So the greater diversity of plants you have, more likely a greater diversity of insects, and then potentially a greater diversity of birds. So to encourage birds to do well in your garden, if you want to have spring birds, it's mostly about having good insects and good insect habitat. But then after that, when you start to move into fall and winter, then it's more important to have all of the species that birds need after that flush of insects disappears off the landscape. So at that point, a huge proportion of birds will transition into eating berries and then also some seeds. So I have a few slides that are all different types of berries and seed plants that you can plant in your garden that are relatively easy to find as far as finding native plants, and then that are also pretty desirable for birds. So I wanted to first talk about berry bushes, because for most people, berry bushes are a great option because given the number of berries on each bush, in spring and midsummer, they have a ton of flowers on them. So most people really like having berry bushes just because they're fragrant and they're often quite pretty to have in your yard. And I know this turned out pretty small, and that's kind of why I maybe should have created a separate presentation for the presentation and then for a handout. But all of this information is on my handout, so if you guys want any of those, feel free to grab them from the table that has the cheatgrass display. But for all of these, I just included what the plant is, and then what the species name is, and then just a quick fact about the plant. And then also I have all of the different types of birds, well, not all of the different types of birds, but what guilds of birds are attracted to different berry bushes. And for people that really like colorful birds, berry bushes are a great option because they attract things like waxwings and orioles, and a few other guilds that most people think are more of your colorful birds that a lot of people like to have in their yard. So these are 5 of our native berry bushes, and they're all found in Gunnison County, and there is some variation in elevation as far as which ones will do well in particular locations. So if you have an interest in putting anything like this in, I would still encourage you to come talk to some of your local, whether it's CSU Extension or the Conservation District or NRCS, and they can all kind of direct you towards what would be the best fit for your yard. The next option would be native seed plants, and these are great for birds like chickadees and sparrows and finches that like to eat seeds. All of these are, with the exception of woods rose, all of these are wind-pollinated species, so they're not going to be as valuable for pollinators, but they're still great for other wildlife. And again, these are all native species that are relatively easy to come by if you're ordering from relatively local sources. And they just provide a little bit more diversity in your yard, depending on what your interest is. And then probably everybody's favorite part is the native flowers. So these are just a small selection. I actually did a couple slides of native flowers. We have a huge amount of floral diversity in Gunnison County, and most of them can do pretty well in people's yards. So there are tons of options. If you're interested, you can find flowers of almost every structure as far as different heights, different size on the ground footprint, and then almost any color that you're interested in having in your garden. These ones that I selected, again, they vary in elevation as far as where you would find them naturally. So again, talking to some of your local resources would be really valuable to figure out what is the best fit for your yard. But almost all of our native perennial flowers are great both for pollinators and for birds. And part of that is because most of the native flowers that we have for a decent proportion of our flowers are these compound flowers where you have either one kind of shrubby type herbaceous plant that has a large number of flowers on it, or you have a single flower that, or a single stalk that has a bunch of flowers on one stalk. And even sunflowers, each of these little interior sections each little spot has its own little amount of nectar. So all of those are great options for attracting both pollinators and birds. So pollinators like them early in the season when they have a lot of nectar, and then later in fall and potentially even in winter, if the seeds are still present, then birds will come in later in the year. And another important thing about native perennials is that most of these plants actually produce a greater amount of nectar than all of your horticultural ones. So you could buy a horticultural columbine that's selected and grown in a greenhouse situation. And then if you compare that to a native columbine, the native columbine actually produces more nectar, so it's more attractive for all of our pollinating species. So the more you can encourage native plants, the better it is from a nutritional standpoint for all of the pollinators, whether that's birds or bees or moths or whatever you have. Again, these are just more of the native pollinators, and this, I think, is a great example of having a huge amount of flowers per plant. Lots of different colors and diversity, so tons of options for attracting whatever kind of birds you're interested in. And then I also wanted to put up some trees. Gunnison County actually has a pretty high tree diversity, and that alone, having diversity, will also increase the diversity of what you have coming to your yard. Most people, I would say, by and large, it seems like most people are interested in having cottonwood or aspen in their yard. And while you wouldn't have the same amount of diversity in just a single yard, some of the native stands of populous species, which includes aspen and cottonwood, can have over 200 species of vertebrates, which is kind of an amazing amount. So those are great wildlife trees, and part of that is that they are relatively soft, so it's easy for woodpeckers to create cavities, and then all of the cavity nesting birds like to hang out in those areas. And then some people like to have juniper in their yard, and I would just caution you that it does escape into sagebrush habitat, so if that's something you're interested in, I would say think about where your yard is and what the potential is for spread outside of there, because that does a lot of damage for sagebrush obligate species. So that would be a good one to talk to your local resources about if that's something you're interested in. And then most of the other pine, spruce, evergreen, all of those species are great species for nesting cover because the needles are so dense that a lot of birds like to hang out in those. So those are great options. And again, all of the trees are pretty variable as far as what elevations and slopes they'll grow on. So again, I would encourage you to reach out to local resources. And then I wanted to provide a couple of online resources too. So this website, someone pointed me towards, and this website, right now I just had it keyed in for Montrose. It's a great resource to get you started. But when you actually, if you type in 81230, it actually brings up the same alkali saccatone as one of the first options, and that's not a good option for here. So this is a great way to get you started so you can start to get some ideas. But this is a good place to kind of scroll through, see what you like, and then come to talk to somebody and figure out what would be a great option. The cool thing about this website is that it also will show you, it gives you a picture of the plant, tells you a little bit about where it grows, so what kind of sun tolerance it has, what soils it likes, and then it'll tell you what kind of birds are attracted to it. So if you decide you want to plant for hummingbirds, then you can go through and figure out which plants all are best for hummingbird habitat. So There are a ton of places you can get native plants. It's easier to look around if you don't want native plants, but so that you guys have a list of sources, these are some of the options that are relatively local, even though it does go out to Utah. Later, there is going to be a talk from the Gunnison Conservation District on getting some of the native trees through the Colorado State Forest Service seedling tree program. So those are both good options, as well as some of these commercial places. The Conservation District will probably cover this more in greater depth, but that's great if you want to get a huge number of plants. So if you're looking to do a bulk order, I would definitely recommend that because it's going to be way more expensive to do any sort of bulk order through any of these other options. And then if you want more information about particular plants or pollinators that you'd be interested in having in your yard, these are all some of the resources. Xerces and Audubon are not local, but the rest of these are all local options, so feel free to come into anybody's office and ask questions, because we're all happy to help answer anything that you might have about that. So does anybody have any questions? Or I can take them later. Oh.
You mentioned woodpeckers. How do you keep the woodpeckers away?
That's a really good question. You might actually know more, Dan. I've heard a few different things. But do you want
I lived in Missouri for a while, and there were these big pileated woodpeckers, which can take out your siding pretty quickly. And one of the things they would do is have a dead bird that they would hang next to the wall, and I don't know where they got the dead bird. That seemed to be semi-effective in trying to get them away, but it's tough because once they're attracted to a certain site, they don't like to leave that, and it's territorial. So yeah, it's a tough one.
What I found to be effective, if you take like a big pop bottle, cut it in two in the middle, and hang surveying strips, that barking thing on the bottom, and hang it out from the house, and then it flutters, and that seems to deter particularly the flickers.
Actually, a really good point too. Some of the things I didn't talk about for backyard, if you want to create backyard bird habitat, having something that flashes in front of your windows too is a great idea, so that they're not hitting windows. I can't quite remember. I want to say it's like the third greatest cause of death for birds is hitting people's windows. So I would definitely recommend having something that kind of flutters, like a mobile or something like that, in front of a window. So that would be one other way you can improve backyard habitat. And another would be keeping your cat indoors, because they are a huge cause of mortality. And that's not just coming from a Save the Birds perspective, but that also increases the longevity of your cat by about twice as long as it would live outside. So those are also a few very quick and easy things to do to improve backyard habitat. So, thanks.
Thanks, Marcella.